Imagine walking through the streets of Kaifeng, China, and stumbling upon a community that claims Jewish ancestry. But they don't speak Hebrew, they look Chinese, and their synagogue vanished centuries ago. How did they get here? And why have most people never heard of them? For nearly 1,000 years, Kaifeng Jews lived in the shadows of Chinese dynasties, surviving wars, floods, and even government suppression. But today, their identity is hanging by a thread. Are they the last remnants of an ancient Jewish migration, or just a forgotten footnote in history? The truth will shock you. Stay tuned. Centuries ago, long before the modern state of Israel was even a dream, a group of Jewish travelers embarked on a journey that would take them farther than any of their ancestors had ever gone. They left behind the lands of Persia and India, carrying with them the sacred Torah, the weight of their traditions, and an unbreakable connection to their faith. But their destination was not Jerusalem, it was China. The year was somewhere around the 10th or 11th century. The world was changing. Empires were rising and falling, and the Great Silk Road was breathing life into cities that lay along its path. One of these cities was Kaifeng, the glittering capital of the mighty Song dynasty. Traders and merchants from across the known world flocked to Kaifeng, where silk, spices, and rare treasures passed from hand to hand. But for these Jewish travelers, this was more than just a business venture. It was destiny. They arrived not as conquerors, but as seekers. Seekers of safety, of opportunity, of a place where they could live in peace, away from the turmoil of the West. In China, they found something unexpected: acceptance. Unlike in Europe, where Jews faced persecution and exile, the Chinese emperor welcomed them. He saw them not as outsiders, but as skilled merchants and scholars who could contribute to the empire's prosperity. The emperor granted them land, permission to settle, and most importantly, the freedom to practice their faith. It was unheard of. In the heart of China, a Jewish community began to take root. They built homes, started businesses, and, perhaps most astonishingly, erected a synagogue, a magnificent structure that stood as a symbol of their resilience. Imagine that moment. A group of Jews, thousands of miles away from Jerusalem, standing in a synagogue they built with their own hands, whispering prayers in Hebrew. Their voices echoed in a land where no one else understood their words. But it didn't matter, because they understood. For generations, they flourished. They became scholars, doctors, translators, and advisors to Chinese officials. Some even served in the imperial court. They adopted Chinese names, wore silk robes like their neighbors, and spoke the local dialect fluently. Yet, within the walls of their homes, they remained Jewish. They observed the Sabbath. They kept kosher. They told their children stories of Moses, of David, of Israel, the homeland most had never seen but never forgot. But time has a way of testing even the strongest communities. As the years passed, something began to change. Their numbers were small, and the tides of history were relentless. The story of Kaifeng's Jews was only just beginning, but so was their struggle to hold on to their identity in a land where their faith would soon face the greatest test of all. Would they endure, or would they be swallowed by time, like so many lost tribes before them? The answer is more surprising than you think. Stay with us as we uncover the next chapter of their incredible journey. Centuries ago, long before Israel reclaimed its place on the world map, a group of Jewish travelers made a journey that defied logic, history, and expectation. They did not set sail for Jerusalem, nor did they wander to the great Jewish centers of Babylon or Spain. Instead, they took a path almost no one would have imagined, deep into the heart of China, to a place where no synagogue had ever stood, no Hebrew prayers had ever been whispered, and no Jewish laws had ever been practiced. What could possibly make a group of Jews leave everything behind? Their homeland, their communities, their familiar ways of life, to venture into a world so vastly different from their own? The answer lies in the great shifting tides of history. in the relentless search for survival, and in the enduring Jewish spirit that has carried the people of Israel across continents and centuries, always seeking a place to call home. The story begins in the 10th or 11th century, in an era when the Jewish world was facing turbulence, the rise and fall of Islamic caliphates, the growing pressures in Christian Europe, and the unending struggle for a secure homeland made life uncertain. Meanwhile, in the East, the Great Silk Road had transformed into a lifeline of trade and opportunity, stretching from Persia to India, from Arabia to China. Along its winding paths, merchants carried silk, spices, and gold, but among them traveled something far more valuable: people searching for freedom. The Jews who arrived in China were not conquerors, not refugees fleeing a single catastrophe, but merchants and scholars who saw something extraordinary in the bustling city of Kaifeng. This was the capital of the mighty Song dynasty, a kingdom of immense wealth and cultural refinement, where emperors ruled with wisdom and pragmatism rather than religious oppression. For the Jews, China was unlike anything they had ever known. There were no pogroms, no forced conversions, no ghettos. Instead, there was something astonishing: acceptance. When the Jewish travelers set foot in Kaifeng, they expected curiosity, perhaps even resistance. Instead, they found a kingdom that valued intellect and skill over race and religion. The Chinese emperor, known for his admiration of scholars and traders, did not see them as foreigners to be feared, but as an asset to his empire. They were granted permission to stay, not in hiding, not as second-class citizens, but as honored guests. They were given land to build homes, rights to establish businesses, and, most remarkably, the freedom to practice their faith. It was something almost unheard of in the medieval world. In the heart of this Chinese city, far from the lands of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, a small but determined Jewish community began to grow. Imagine that first Shabbat. A group of Jewish families, thousands of miles from Israel, lighting candles in a foreign land. The air filled with the murmur of Hebrew prayers, words that no one around them understood, but words that connected them to their ancestors, to their faith, to their identity. Soon, they built more than just homes. They built a synagogue, a magnificent structure that stood as a testament to their resilience. It wasn't made of the stone and marble of Jerusalem, nor did it echo with the voices of thousands like in Spain or Baghdad, but it was theirs, a sacred place where the Torah was read, where generations of Jewish children would learn the stories of Moses and David, where the dream of Israel lived on. They followed Jewish customs, but with time, they also embraced elements of Chinese culture. They dressed in silk robes like their neighbors, spoke the Chinese dialect fluently, and even took Chinese surnames. Yet, inside their homes, they remained Jewish. They kept kosher, observed the Sabbath, and passed down their traditions with unwavering devotion. For centuries, they thrived in harmony with their Chinese neighbors. They became scholars, doctors, translators, and advisors to the emperor. Some even held positions in the imperial court, a fate unimaginable for Jews in Europe. It was, in many ways, a golden age, a rare moment in Jewish history where a community flourished without fear, without exile, without the looming threat of destruction. But history has a way of testing even the strongest of communities, and Kaifeng's Jews were no exception. The world was changing, and so was China. The fall of the Song dynasty in the 13th century brought chaos as Mongol invaders stormed across the land. When the Mongols established the Yuan dynasty, the Jews, like everyone else, had to adapt. Some prospered under Mongol rule, but others struggled as their once protected status faded. Then came the devastating floods of the Yellow River, wiping out entire sections of Kaifeng, including the Great Synagogue. With it, centuries of Jewish texts, Hebrew scrolls, and religious artifacts were lost. But the biggest challenge was not war or natural disaster. It was time itself. Over generations, as the Jewish community remained small, intermarriage with Chinese families became inevitable. The Hebrew language, once spoken fluently, started fading. The distinct Jewish identity that had been preserved for centuries began to blur. Yet, even as the rituals became less frequent and the Torah scrolls gathered dust, something remained. An unshakable awareness that they were different, that they were part of something bigger, that their ancestors had once walked the streets of Jerusalem, had once prayed at the temple, had once dreamed of returning to Israel. By the time Jesuit missionaries stumbled upon the Kaifeng Jews in the 17th century, they were astonished to find a Jewish community in the heart of China. But they also saw something tragic: people who still called themselves Jewish but had lost much of what made them so. The ancient prayers were still whispered, but in voices uncertain of their meanings. The traditions were still followed, but not with the same knowledge that had once defined them. For centuries, the Jewish community of Kaifeng had defied the odds, surviving in isolation, thriving against all expectations. But the forces of history had finally caught up with them. Would they endure? Or would they fade away, becoming just another lost chapter in the long, winding story of the Jewish people? As we uncover the next chapter of their journey, one question lingers. Are the Jews of Kaifeng still Jewish? And if they are, will the world recognize them before it's too late? The answer is more complicated than you think. Stay with us as we reveal the surprising truth. For centuries, Kaifeng's Jews had flourished, living in harmony with their Chinese neighbors. They had built a synagogue, raised families, and passed down their traditions with quiet resilience. They had survived wars, dynastic shifts, and even the slow erosion of their connection to Hebrew. But history, as always, is relentless. No golden age lasts forever. The very empire that had once welcomed them, the mighty Song dynasty, fell in the late 13th century. The Mongols, fierce warriors from the north, swept across China, toppling dynasties, shattering cities, and changing the course of history. When the Mongols took power and established the Yuan dynasty, everything shifted. At first, the Kaifeng Jews adapted, just as they always had. Under Mongol rule, they remained merchants and scholars, but something was different. The imperial court no longer saw them as a special or distinct community. They were no longer honored guests, just another group among the vast sea of subjects. Their privileged status disappeared. With time, their unique identity began to blur. They still kept their traditions, still whispered the Shema, still gathered on Shabbat. But the world around them was changing faster than they could hold on. A Jewish community thrives when it has strong foundations, language, education, and a deep connection to its past. The Jews of Kaifeng had started to lose something crucial, their Hebrew. For generations, they had clung to the sacred texts brought by their ancestors. But as fewer and fewer children learned to read Hebrew, the ability to study the Torah in its original language began to fade. They still followed Jewish customs, but they did so with Chinese words. They still told the stories of Abraham and Moses, but they did so in the language of Confucius and Laozi. And then something else changed: marriage. In the early days, the Kaifeng Jews had remained largely separate, marrying only within their community. But as time passed and as their numbers remained small, intermarriage with the local Chinese population became inevitable. It was not a single moment, not a single decision, but a slow, steady shift over generations. Jewish men married Chinese women, and their children grew up with both traditions. The line between Jewish and Chinese identity became harder to define. At first, they held on to their faith. They continued to practice, continued to gather for prayers. But with each passing generation, the Jewish customs became harder to maintain. The memories of distant Israel, of ancient Jerusalem, grew fainter. And then came the disaster that would change everything. In the 1600s, the mighty Yellow River, the lifeblood of Kaifeng, turned against its people. The river, known for its unpredictable nature, flooded the city in a disaster so great that it wiped out entire neighborhoods. Homes were destroyed. Businesses vanished. And most devastating of all, the great Kaifeng synagogue, the heart of the Jewish community, was washed away. The Torah scrolls, the prayer books, the centuries-old relics of Jewish life in China, gone. Imagine what that moment must have felt like. For generations, the synagogue had been more than just a place of worship. It had been a symbol of survival, a link to the past, a reminder that no matter how far they were from Jerusalem, they were still Jews. Now, it was nothing but ruins. Some of the Kaifeng Jews tried to rebuild, but something had changed. Without a central place of worship, without the texts to guide them, the traditions that had been passed down for centuries became harder to maintain. The younger generations, raised in a world where Jewish customs were already blending with Chinese culture, began to drift away. The faith that had once defined them was slipping from their grasp. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Kaifeng Jews still called themselves Jewish, but their knowledge of Judaism had grown faint. The prayers were still said, but often without understanding their true meaning. The festivals were still observed, but without the same depth of knowledge that had once shaped their ancestors' lives. And yet, despite everything, they never stopped believing that they were Jewish, even as they became more and more assimilated, even as they lost their Hebrew names and took Chinese ones, even as their community grew smaller and smaller, they still clung to their identity, if only by a thread. But without Hebrew, without strong communal leadership, and without a synagogue to anchor them, the Jewish life they had once known had all but disappeared. The world was moving forward. The Jewish people in other parts of the world were facing their own struggles, exile, persecution, and eventually the dream of a new homeland in Israel. But the Jews of Kaifeng? They were disappearing, not because of violence, not because of forced conversion, but because time itself was pulling them away. Would they vanish completely? Or was there still a spark waiting to be reignited? The story of Kaifeng's Jews was not over yet. But the next chapter would be the most uncertain of all. Stay with us as we uncover what happened next. For centuries, the Jews of Kaifeng had lived in quiet obscurity. Their ancestors had arrived as merchants, scholars, and wanderers, forging a life in the heart of China. They had built a synagogue, raised families, and blended seamlessly into their surroundings, while holding on, however loosely, to their Jewish identity. But history is relentless, and time is unforgiving. By the 17th century, the Grand Synagogue had been lost to the devastating floods of the Yellow River. The Torah scrolls, the sacred texts, and the very foundation of Jewish life had been washed away. With each passing generation, their Hebrew faded, their customs diluted, and their link to the wider Jewish world nearly severed. But then, something remarkable happened. The outside world stumbled upon them once more. The Jesuits arrive. A startling discovery. It was the 1600s when Jesuit missionaries, European priests spreading Christianity in China, arrived in Kaifeng. Their mission was clear: to convert the Chinese to Catholicism. But as they walked the streets, speaking with scholars and locals, they heard whispers of something unexpected. People who were neither Christian nor Buddhist, neither Muslim nor Confucian. A people who spoke of one God, who refused to eat pork, who claimed descent from Abraham. The Jesuits were stunned. Could it be true? A lost Jewish community hidden away in the heart of China? Curious, they sought them out. What they found astonished them. The Kaifeng Jews had lost much of their Hebrew knowledge, yet they still clung to their traditions. They still celebrated Passover, still observed the Sabbath, still held on to the memory of their ancestors. But the Jesuits saw something else: an opportunity. To them, these Jews were people who had strayed from God's true path. They believed that with enough persuasion, they could be converted to Christianity. So they befriended the community, studied their customs, and even helped them acquire religious texts. The Kaifeng Jews, desperate to reconnect with their lost traditions, accepted the help. Some even traveled to Jesuit schools, where they were taught Hebrew again, but also Christian doctrine. For the first time in centuries, the Kaifeng Jews had re-entered the global conversation. But at what cost? A struggle to hold on. As news of the Kaifeng Jews spread, Western Jewish organizations took notice. European Jews, hearing of their long-lost brethren, sent scholars and emissaries to Kaifeng. Some came with hopes of reviving the community. Others simply wanted to document this astonishing piece of Jewish history. But it was too late. By the 19th century, the once thriving Jewish community had dwindled to a shadow of its former self. The Grand Synagogue, already in ruins, was never rebuilt. Without a center of worship, without rabbis, without formal education, their traditions had faded even further. And then, the world around them changed. China was entering a period of chaos. Foreign invasions, dynastic collapse, and civil wars. The Qing dynasty, ruling with an iron grip, was suspicious of outsiders. The Jewish community, already small and fragile, faced new pressures. Many Jews in Kaifeng had no choice but to fully assimilate. They adopted Chinese names, Chinese customs, and Chinese ways of life. Some still whispered their Jewish identity in private, passing down stories from their ancestors. Others let it slip away entirely, disappearing into the vast fabric of Chinese society. By the time the 20th century arrived, the Jewish presence in Kaifeng was barely noticeable. The communist era, silence and survival. The rise of communism in China under Mao Zedong changed everything. Religion of any kind was viewed with suspicion. Churches, temples, and mosques were closed or destroyed. Religious leaders were arrested, and any open expression of faith became dangerous. For the few remaining Jewish families in Kaifeng, the message was clear: stay silent or suffer the consequences. The Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976, was especially brutal. Any connection to the past was seen as counter-revolutionary. Torah scrolls, old family heirlooms, anything that hinted at religious identity had to be hidden or destroyed. For many, this was the final blow. By the time China began to reopen to the world in the late 20th century, the Kaifeng Jews were no longer a thriving community. Their identity had been buried under centuries of assimilation, foreign intervention, and political upheaval. But something remarkable was about to happen: a modern awakening. In the 1990s and early 2000s, as China modernized and became more open to the world, a surprising thing began to take place. Some descendants of the Kaifeng Jews started searching for their roots. They had heard stories from their grandparents, whispers of a past that had almost been erased. Some had vague memories of traditions that had been passed down but never fully explained. And then, through books, through the internet, through contact with Jewish communities abroad, they discovered the truth. They were the descendants of the Kaifeng Jews. Organizations from Israel and the West took notice. Some Jewish groups, eager to help, sent aid, books, and teachers to reconnect these descendants with their lost heritage. A few young Kaifeng Jews even traveled to Israel, learning Hebrew, studying Judaism, and embracing the identity their ancestors had fought so hard to keep. Yet the road has not been easy. The struggle to be recognized today, the Kaifeng Jews are few in number. Some still practice remnants of Jewish customs, while others are rediscovering their roots. But the Chinese government does not officially recognize Judaism as a religion. This means no synagogues, no official Jewish schools, and no legal Jewish identity. Even those who have studied in Israel, who have re-embraced their Jewish heritage, struggle to be seen as Jews in the eyes of the world. Are they still Jewish? Do centuries of assimilation erase their claim? Or does the blood of their ancestors, the memory of their traditions, still make them part of the people of Israel? The answer depends on who you ask. For some, they are a lost tribe, waiting to be fully welcomed back. For others, they are simply a fascinating relic of history, a community that once was but no longer is. But for the descendants of the Kaifeng Jews, the journey is not over. they continue to fight for recognition, to reclaim their heritage, and to remind the world that even after 1,000 years, they are still here, still Jewish, still holding on, and perhaps, against all odds, they always will. For nearly 1,000 years, the Jews of Kaifeng endured. They weathered dynasties rising and falling, wars, floods, and cultural shifts that would have erased any other small community. They adapted, blending into Chinese society while keeping the flickering light of their Jewish identity alive. But as time marched on, that light grew dimmer, and today it is barely visible. The question now is, what happens next? This question is not as simple as it seems. For centuries they practiced Jewish traditions, even as their knowledge of Hebrew faded. They observed Passover, kept some form of kashrut, and passed down their unique history. But without rabbis, without Jewish schools, and with generations of intermarriage, their link to traditional Judaism weakened. Today, many of their descendants still identify as Jewish. Some have worked hard to reconnect, learning Hebrew, studying Torah, and even making Aliyah to Israel. But others have lived so long as Chinese citizens, disconnected from global Jewish life, that their Jewishness is a distant memory, more of a historical fact than a lived reality. And then, there is the official stance. China does not officially recognize Judaism as one of its 5 state-approved religions. There are mosques for Muslims, churches for Christians, and temples for Buddhists and Taoists. But there are no synagogues, no formal Jewish institutions. This means that the descendants of Kaifeng Jews cannot legally practice Judaism in an official capacity. They cannot openly gather for worship, nor can they teach the next generation about their faith without government restrictions. For those who want to reclaim their Jewish heritage, this is a major obstacle. Some have managed to secretly hold Shabbat gatherings, whispering ancient prayers in a language their ancestors once spoke fluently. Others have traveled abroad to study, only to return home and find themselves unable to live as Jews openly. The Jewish world is divided. Some say that Kaifeng Jews should be welcomed back with open arms. After all, history has shown that Jewish communities can survive even the harshest conditions. If these descendants still feel a connection to Judaism, shouldn't they have the chance to reclaim it? Shouldn't Israel recognize them as part of the lost family? Others argue that Kaifeng Jews, despite their rich history, have lost too much over the centuries. Without Hebrew fluency, without rabbis, without strong communal structures, they are too far removed. But then another question arises. Who decides? Who has the right to say whether someone is still Jewish or not? In Israel, some Kaifeng Jews have been granted the opportunity to convert formally, making their status official. Others have been rejected, told that their Jewish lineage is too diluted. It is a painful reality for those who have spent their lives believing they are part of a people that now hesitates to embrace them. The world is changing rapidly, and with it, so is the fate of Kaifeng Jews. Their numbers are small, their traditions fragile. With every passing year, another generation grows up further removed from the customs of their ancestors. The last elders who remember the old ways are disappearing, and with them, a piece of history is slipping away. But does that mean their story is over? Perhaps not. History has shown that Jewish identity is not easily erased. From Spain to Ethiopia, from Persia to India, lost and hidden, Jewish communities have resurfaced against all odds. Could the same happen for the Jews of Kaifeng? If the world remembers them, if Israel embraces them, if they continue to fight for recognition, their story may not end in silence. But if they are forgotten, if they are left without support, then their 1,000-year journey, from the traders who first arrived in China to the modern descendants searching for their roots, may quietly disappear. And that is the real tragedy. The story of the Kaifeng Jews is not just about one small community. It is about identity, about survival, about the lengths to which people will go to hold on to their faith, their history, their connection to something greater than themselves. So now we ask you, Should the world stand by as they fade into history? Or should their story be told, remembered, and honored? Their fate is uncertain, but their history is undeniable. If you found this story moving, if you believe their journey deserves to be remembered, then share this video. Let the world know that Kaifeng Jews were here, that they mattered, and that their legacy should not be forgotten. Like this video. Subscribe to the channel. And keep exploring the untold stories of our past, because history is never truly lost as long as we choose to remember.